am your host, G.I. Wingnut. Welcome back to my channel. We are continuing with part 2 of Atlantis and Lemuria by Rudolph Steiner from 1911. So let's go ahead and move on into chapter 2. Chapter 2, Our Atlantean Forefathers. Our Atlantean ancestors differed more from the men of today than may be imagined by anyone who is wholly limited to the world of sense for his knowledge. Still sounding a lot like L. Ron Hubbard. I'm thinking I know where he got some of his ideas. Continuing, this difference extends not only to outward appearance, but also to mental capacities. Their science and also their technical arts, their whole civilization differed much from that of our day. If we go back to the early times of Atlantean humanity, we shall find that there are a mental capacity, or there, let me try that again. If we go back to the early times of Atlantean humanity, we shall find there a mental capacity altogether different from our own. Logical reasoning, the calculatory combinations upon which all that is produced at the present day is based, were entirely wanting in the early Atlanteans, but in place of these they possessed a highly developed memory. This memory was one of their most prominent mental faculties. For example, they did not count as we do by the application of certain acquired rules. Breaking down that modern thinking. Confusion. Oh, you just don't understand. Okay. No one had impressed upon his understanding the fact that 3 times 4 were 12. Oh, so they did math without math? What? Okay. Good grief. Continuing, a person's ability to make such a calculation, when necessary, rested on the fact that he could remember cases of same or similar kind. Oh, learning by association. Interesting. He remembered how this was done on former occasions. Now it must be clearly understood that whenever a new faculty is developed in a being, an old one loses its force and precision. Oh, that reminds me of that Jennifer Aniston commercial for DoorDash or Amazon or one of those delivery services that where she said, to remember something, you have to forget something. Now, hint, hint, Jennifer Aniston is a Scientologist. So, yeah, in Scientology terms, they would be recalling facsimiles. Okay, I'm digressing here. He remembered how this was done on former occasions. Okay, so there's your Scientology facsimile. Now, it must be clearly understood that, okay, I already read that. The man of the present day has the advantage over the Atlanteans of possessing a logical understanding and an aptitude for combination, but on the other hand, his memory power has waned. We now think in ideas, the Atlantean thought in pictures. Okay, yeah, there's L. Ron Hubbard again. Okay, we now think in ideas. The Atlanteans thought in pictures, hieroglyphs. And when a picture rose in his mind, he remembered many other similar pictures which he had formerly seen, and then formed his judgment accordingly. Oh, wow. So that is where L. Ron Hubbard got that. All right. Interesting. Moving on. Consequently, all education then was quite different from that of latter times. It was not intended to provide the child with rules or to sharpen his wits. Rather, was life presented to him in comprehensive pictures so that subsequently he could call to remembrance as much as possible when dealing with this or that circumstance. When the child had grown up and had reached maturity, he could remember, no matter what he might have to do, that something similar had shown him in the days of his instruction. He saw clearly how to act when the new event resembled something already seen. Oh, so like a memory bank full of YouTube how-to videos. Gotcha. Um, let's see. When absolutely new conditions arose, the Atlantean found himself compelled to experiment, which the man of today is spared much in this direction, being furnished with a set of rules which he can easily apply in circumstances new to him. What? No, humans are constantly running experiments, even if it's just to validate prior evidence, prior experiments. That's how the scientific method works. If you can repeat it and get the same successful result, then it's good science. Oh my goodness. All right, so when absolutely new conditions arose, the Atlantean found himself compelled to experiment, while the man of today is spared much of this direction, being furnished a set of rules which he can easily apply to circumstances new to him. Such a system of education gave a strong uniformity to the entire life. Things were done again and again in exactly the same way during very long periods of time. The faithfulness of memory offered no scope of anything at all approaching the rapidity of their own progress. A man did what he had always seen before. He did not think, he remembered. So no progress. No progress whatsoever. No new inventions, which is contradictory to experimentation with new situations. What is it? Necessity is the mother of invention? Oh boy. Anyway, not he who had learnt much was held as an authority, but he who had experienced a great deal and could therefore remember much. It would have been impossible in the Atlantean times for anyone who had reached a certain age to be called upon to decide on any affair of importance. Confidence was placed only in one who could look back on a long experience. Interesting. What is here said does not refer to initiates and their schools, for they, indeed, are beyond the average development of their time, meaning they've already picked up some of the secret knowledge. Continuing, and for admission into such schools, age is not the deciding factor, but rather the consideration. Rather, the candidate in his former incarnations has acquired the ability to assimilate the higher wisdom. The confidence placed in initiates and their agents in Atlantean times was not based on the extent of was not based on the extent of their personal experience, but on the age of their wisdom. Okay, I got to interject here. Knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. All right, moving on. For an initiate, his own personality has ceased to have any importance. He is entirely at the service of the eternal wisdom, and therefore the characteristics of any period of time have no weight with him. Self-sacrifice to the point of losing one's own identity? Let's see. How many ways can I reference that? Let's see. Evangelical Christians and their dominionism, Buddhism, yoga cults, Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Let's see. Mike Flynn, Scientology. There's so many more. All right, moving on. Thus, while the power of logical thinking was still wanting, especially in the earlier Atlanteans, they possessed in their highly developed power of memory something which gave a special character to their whole activity. But other powers were also bound up with the nature of one's special human force, that inner energy. Okay. That manifestation power. Uh, anyway, moving on. Memory is nearer to the deeper foundations laid by nature in man than is the power of reason, and in connection with the former, other impulses were developed which bore greater resemblance to those lower nature forces, that the motive forces of human action at the present day. So, is this a reference to the development of the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human brain? Or are they trying to make some sort of reference to genetic memory? Just asking questions. Moving on. Thus, the Atlantean was master of what is called the life force. Oh, the life force. Um, the Chinese call it qi, and the Jedi call it the Force. Anyway, well, I guess the Sith call it the Force too. Moving on. Just as we now draw from coal the force of warmth, which is changed into the force of propulsion in our methods of traffic, so did Atlanteans understand the use of germinal forces of living things in the service of their technological works. Oh, that sounds like some DARPA stuff right there. Biological technologies? Interesting. Lucius Trust manipulating technology and mimicking nature. Just putting that out there. Moving on. An illustration of this may be given as follows. Let us think of a grain of corn. In it slumbers a force. This force acts in such a way that out of the grain of corn the stalk sprouts forth. It's called the miracle of life. Moving on, nature can awaken this sleeping force in the grain, but the man of today cannot do it at will. He must bury the grain in the earth and leave its awakening to the forces of nature. Boy, oh boy. The Atlantean could do something more. He knew what to do in order to transform the force in a heap of corn into mechanical power, just as the man of our day can transform into a like power the force of warmth in a heap of coal. Oh, so they knew how to make grain alcohol and burn it? Is that what they're saying? Good grief. Moving on. In Atlantean times, plants were not cultured merely for use as food, but also in order that the slumbering force in them might be rendered serviceable to their commerce and industry. Ah, green energies, renewables. Interesting. Moving on. Just as we have contrivances for devices for heating by the use of plant seeds in which the life force was changed into a power acceptable or applicable to technical purposes. In this way were propelled the airships of the Atlanteans, which soar a little above the earth. These airships sailed at a height rather below that of the mountains of the Atlantean times, and they had steering appliances by means of which they could be raised above the mountains. It sounds like dirigibles. Interesting. I'm not believing anything of what I'm reading here. I'm just trying to break this apart for you. We must picture ourselves that with the advance of time, all the conditions of our earth have greatly changed. I'll give them that. These airships of the Atlanteans would be quite useless in our days. Why? Why? Their utility lay in the fact that at that time, the atmosphere enveloped our Earth was much denser than now. Oh, that just means that the aircraft, these airships, would fly higher, easier. Good grief. Moving on. Whether according to the scientific conceptions of the present day, such an increased density of the air can easily be or can be easily conceived, need not concern us here. Science and logical thought can never, from their very nature, determine what is possible and what is impossible. Oh my goodness. That reminds me of a quote I heard here a while back of Candace Owens calling science a cult. Wow. Moving on. And the density of the air here spoken of is, in occult experience, as much a certainty as any given fact of the world of sense can be today. And just as firmly established is the fact, perhaps even more inexplicable to the physics and chemistry of our time, that in those days the water over the whole of the earth was much more fluid than it is now. Are they leaning towards flat earth and a firmament concept? I wouldn't doubt it. Anyway, moving on. And owing to its fluidity, water being driven by means of the life force in seeds could be used by the Atlanteans for technical purposes impossible today. What? On account of the densification of water, it has become impossible to set it in motion and to guide in the same time premeditate or to guide it in the same premeditated manner as was once possible. So telekinetic powers used to be a thing according to these people, but apparently we've been dumbed down, or it was just lost through evolution. I don't know. It's not clear at this point. Moving on. From this, it is sufficiently evident that the civilization of Atlanteans' times differed fundamentally from our own, and it would also be readily conceived that the physical nature of an Atlantean was quite different from that of the contemporary man. Yeah, they if we remember from the root races, the Atlanteans had a physical form, but they were sexless, kind of like the Hyperboreans, if I recall correctly. Hmm. Water, when drunk by Atlanteans, can be worked upon by the life force within the body in quite another way than is possible in the physical body of today. Wow. Boy, they're just reaching for all kinds of crazy stuff. And thus it arose that the Atlantean could use his physical strength at will, quite otherwise than themselves. He had, as it were, the means within himself of increasing physical forces when he required them for his own use. It is only possible to picture the Atlanteans correctly when one knows that they had conceptions of fatigue and the loss of strength absolutely different from our own. An Atlantean settlement, as may be gathered from what has already been said, bore a characteristic in no way resembling that of a modern town, but there was a much deeper, closer resemblance between it and nature. Oh, like a hobbit, like the Shire? Interesting. Moving on, we can only give a faint suggestion to the real picture when we say that in early Atlantean times, until the middle of the third subrace, the settlement resembled a garden in which the houses formed themselves out of trees whose branches were intertwined in an artistic manner. Oh, we've seen that in some AI stuff, haven't we? Maybe. I might have to see if I can find a clip of that or a picture of that throw in here. Or are they describing another variation of Eden? Or is this where Kat Kerr got her ideas for the happy forest in heaven? That sounded a whole lot like the Land of Oz with talking trees and stuff. All right, moving on. Whatever the hand of man fashioned at that time grew naturally in like manner. Man, too, felt himself entirely akin to nature, and so it arose that his social instinct was quite different from our own. Nature, indeed, took the common property of all men, and whatever the Atlantean built up with nature for its foundation, he regarded as common property. You will own nothing. Precisely as the man of today thinks it only natural to regard as his own private property that which his acuteness and his reason have produced. Common property. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Get rid of borders. So it sounded to me a whole lot like this doctrine may be pulled in by the United Nations. Not 100% sure on that. I could be wrong. Anyone who familiarizes himself with the idea that the Atlanteans were endowed with such mental and physical powers as have been depicted will likewise learn to understand that at still earlier periods mankind presents an aspect which very faintly reminds us of what we are accustomed to see today. So they're making reference to the decline of man. All right. Continuing. And not only man, but nature, which surrounds him, has also changed enormously in the course of time. Well, that would be expected with atmospheric changes. I mean, look at what we're going through to now. Going on. Moving on. With regard to the time periods at which the conditions shown held sway, something more will be said in the course of these communications. For the present, the reader is warned not to be surprised if the few figures given him in the previous chapter seem to contradict what he finds elsewhere. So, reality is a lie? Is that what they're saying? Moving on. The forms of plant and animal have altered. The whole of terrestrial nature has undergone a transformation. Regions of the earth which were formerly inhabited have been destroyed, and others have risen. Oh, another reference back to that whole Younger Dryas period conspiracy theory. Moving on. The forefathers of the Atlanteans lived in a part of the earth which has disappeared, the principal portion of which lay to the south of what is Asia today. In theosophical literature, they are called Lemurians because of the lemurs in Madagascar and India, I think it was. Anyway, moving on. After passing through various stages of evolution, the greater number fell into decadence. Oh, the fall of man, sin, sin. Anyway, moving on. They became a stunted race whose descendants, the so-called savages, inhabit certain portions of the earth even now. Only a small number of Lemurians were capable of advancing in their evolution, and it was from these that the Atlantean race developed. Still later, something similar occurred. The great mass of the inhabitants of Atlantis fell into decadence, and the so-called Aryans, to which race belongs the humanity of our present civilization, sprang from a small division of these Atlanteans. Genetic superiority? Are we still talking eugenics? Just asking. Moving on. According to the nomenclature of the, quote, secret doctrine, end quote, Lemurians, Atlanteans, and Aryans are root races of humanity. If we think of two such root races preceding the Lemurians, the two following the Aryan in the future, we have altogether 7. And the one always arises out of the other in a manner pointed out in the case of the Lemurian, Atlantean, and Aryan races. And no, this isn't the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germanic Aryans. That word got obfuscated. Moving on. And each root race has physical and mental qualities entirely different from those of that which precedes it. While, for example, the Atlantean brought his memory and everything in connection with it to a high degree of development, the duty of the Aryan of the present is to develop thought power and all that appertains to hereto or thereto. But each root race itself must pass through different stages, and these again are always sevenfold. Seven mountain mandate. Maybe I'm just grasping at straws. Sevens. Seven's a number of perfection, right? Supposedly. Moving on. At the beginning of the time period belonging to a root race, its lead characteristics appear in an immature state. They gradually reach maturity and then, at last, decadence. Thus, the members of a root race are divided into 7 sub-root races. However, it must not be imagined that one sub-race immediately disappeared on the development of a new one. On the contrary, every one of them continued to exist for a long time, while others flourished beside. Oh, like the Neanderthal and Homo sapien coexisting in the timeline, archaeological timeline. Thus, there are always dwellers on the earth living side by side, but showing the most varied stages of evolution. Oh, like the transition from the Hyperboreans, I think it was, into the Aryans, where there was colors. Colors came into play. Races. All right, moving on. The first subroot race of the Atlanteans arose from a portion of the Lemurian race, which was greatly advanced and capable of further evolution. Yeah, this is sounding like a basis for eugenics for sure. Continuing. For instance, in this latter race, the gift of memory showed itself only in its very earliest beginnings, and even so much did not appear until the latest stages of evolution. It must be realized that a Lemurian could indeed make images of his experiences but could not preserve them as recollections. He immediately forgot what he had pictured to himself. That, in spite of this, he lived a certain extent of civilized life. For instance, that he possessed tools, erected buildings, and so on, was not due to his own imagination, but to an inner mental force, which was instinctive. Oh, man. Continuing. And yet, we must not imagine an instinct similar to that which animals possess at the present time, but an instinct of another order. Interesting. I wonder what he means there. An instinct of another order? All right, moving on. The first subroot race of the Atlanteans is called in theosophical literature the Rohal. I guess Mohal? Mohal? The memory of this race was especially derived for vivid sense impressions, colors which the eye had seen, tones which the ear had heard, continued to operate within the soul. Oh, wow, that takes me to the occult practices of Nikola Tesla. With understanding the secrets of the universe only requires understanding frequency, vibration, and energy. Moving on. This was manifested in the fact that the Ramals developed feelings quite unknown to their Lemurian ancestors. For instance, adherence to that which had been experienced in the past constituted part of such feelings. So feelings are part of a degraded state? We're not supposed to have feelings? Is that what they're saying? Huh. Interesting. They're trying to breed psychopaths and sociopaths, it sounds like. Moving on. Now the development of speech depended upon that of memory. As long as man did not remember the past, there could be no narration of experiences by means of speech. Oh, like the downsizing of the dictionary in 1984. New speech. Eventually, you'll have so few words that no emotions can be transmitted. Anyway, moving on. And because the first rudiments of a memory appeared in the latest Lemurian period, it was only when possible that the ability to give names to things heard and seen could appear to, or begin to appear. Oh, things that go bump in the night. All right, moving on. It is only those who have the faculty of recollection who can make any use of a name which has been given to an object. And consequently, it was in the Atlantean period that speech found its development, and with speech a tie that forms between the human soul and things exterior to the man. Since he then produced the spoken word from within himself, the spoken word appertained to the objects of the outer world. Through communication by means of speech, a new bond also a new, I'm sorry, through communication by means of speech, a new bond arose between man and man. All this, indeed, was still in an elementary form at the time of the Ramals, but nevertheless it distinguished them profoundly from their Lemurian ancestors. Now the forces in the souls of these first Atlanteans still retained something of the force of nature. Man was then, in a certain manner, more nearly related to the nature spirits surrounding him than were his descendants. Their soul forces were more nature forces than are those of the men of the present, and so, too, the spoken word which they uttered had something of the might of nature. Oh, like Cat Kerr turning storms, or trying to, with the power of words in the name of Jesus, which I've noticed she's failed a few times. Anyway, moving on. Not only did they name objects, but their words contained a power over things and over their fellow creatures. Dominionism by the power of words. Wow. Moving on. The word of Ramoal possessed more than mere meaning. It also had power. When we speak of the magic force of words, we indicate something which was a far greater reality at that time and for those men than it is for men of the present. Wow, this sounds an awful lot like Solar Temple and the Rosicrucians. There are links. I've shown that in other videos. When a Moal pronounced a word, this word developed a force akin to that of the object designated by it. Ah, it sounds like some of that "We Are Little Gods." I am that I am, and so am I, as King Copeland said. Holy cow. Um, Blab it and grab it. Word of faith gospel kind of stuff. All right, moving on. Hence, it is that words had the power of healing at that time, and that they could hasten the growth of plants, tame the rage of animals, and produce other specific effects. Straight up some Harry Potter stuff. And what was Beastmaster? That old 1980s movie, Beastmaster? All right, so moving on. All of this force gradually faded away among the latter Atlantean subraces. It might be said that that fullness of strength which was produced was a product of nature, wasted away little by little. The men of the Moal race regarded such fullness of strength altogether as a gift from mighty nature herself. And this relation of theirs with nature, bore for them a religious character. Speech was, to them, something especially sacred, and the misuse of certain tones, in which dwelt a significant power, was to them an impossibility. Every individual felt that such misuse must bring him terrible injury. Careful what you wish for. Moving on. The magic of such words, they thought, would change into its opposite. That which, rightly used, would cause a blessing, would cause a blessing, would, good grief, this is hard to read. The magic of such words, they thought, would change into its opposite. That which rightly used would cause a blessing, would bring the author to ruin if wrongly employed. Authorial intent. Something I've heard Q people talking about. Moving on. In a certain innocence of feeling, the Mohals ascribed their power less to themselves than to divine nature working in them. Hear a lot of that in the New Apostolic Reformation. It was otherwise in the second sub race, the so-called, the T people. The men of this race began to feel their own personal value, ambition, and unknown quality among Moals shown itself in them. They might say that the faculty of memory grew into a comprehension of life in communities. He could look back on certain deeds and demand them from his fellow men, some recognition of his ability. He claimed that his work should be held in remembrance, and it was this memory of deeds that was the basis on which rested the election by a group of men allied to each other, a certain one as leader. So, merit-based judging and leadership qualities for best qualified? Okay. A kind of kingship arose. Okay. I get you now. Moving on. Indeed, this recognition extended beyond death. The beginnings of noble bloodlines? Just asking. Moving on. The remembrance, the commemoration of forefathers or of those who, during life, had one merit rose in this way, and thus in single family groups there grew up a kind of religious reverence for the dead. In other words, ancestor worship. Yeah, I was going to call it out as that, but okay, there we go. Moving on. This has continued to spread into much later times and has taken the most varied forms. Among the Moals, a man was still esteemed only according to the degree in which, for the moment, he was able to make himself valuable by the greatness of his power. Did anyone want recognition for what he had done in former days? Then he must show by new deeds that he still possessed the old power. All right. Okay. Oh, you say you could do it? Prove it. Show me. I mean, I am from Missouri. We are the show me state. Moving on. That which had once been done was valueless in itself. Not until the second subrace was the personal character of a man of so much account that his past life was taken into consideration in the estimation of it. A further result of the power of thought in drawing men to live together appeared in the fact that groups of men were formed who were united by the remembrance of deeds done in the company. Groupthink, club mentality, belonging to something bigger than yourself. The former of such groups originally continuing. The forming of such groups originally depended wholly upon the forces of nature, on their common parentage. But, good grief, I'm hearing the New Apostolic Reformation all through this. This is wild. By his own intelligence, continuing. By his own intelligence, man has yet added nothing to which nature had made of him. One mighty personality now enlisted a great company to share in a common undertaking, and the remembrance of this work, being retained by all, built up a social group. Good grief. I'm hearing a lot of Elron in this too. Moving on. This manner of living together in social groups only impressed itself forcibly when the third subrace, the Toltec, was reached. It was therefore the men of this race who first founded what many have called a commonwealth, the earliest kind of statecraft. The leadership, the government of this commonwealth passed from ancestor to descendants. That which had formerly continued only in the memory of their fellow men, the Father now transferred to the Son. Okay, so this reminds me of some alternative history stuff about Inca 1, the first Incan ruler. When he died, Inca 2, his son took over. And when his son took over, allegedly, he fired his father's entire governmental group, all the advisors and everybody, and started from scratch, so there wouldn't be any old blood hanging around. No old habits to break. Interesting. So maybe that's where this idea, maybe this is where that idea comes from. Moving on. Education was based upon the presentation of life in comprehensive pictures, and the efficacy of this education depended on the personal force which proceeded from the teacher. It was not an intellectual power which he sought to excite, but rather those gifts which were more instinctive in character, like controlling storms, maybe, or healing people with words, maybe. Moving on. By such a system of education, the father's ability was really, in most cases, transferred to the son. Under conditions like these, personal experience won for itself more and more importance in the third subrace. When one group of humans severed itself from another, it brought with it, for the formation of its new community, the vivid recollection of what had been experienced in its former surroundings. But all the same, these memories contained something with which they were not in sympathy, something in which they did not feel at ease. In this connection, therefore, they sought something new, and thus conditions improved with every new settlement of the kind. They sought something new. New Apostolic Reformation is always seeking something new signs, new revelations, new ways of doing things, like a Willy Wonka themed church I just heard about. Anyway, moving on. And it was only natural that the improved conditions should find imitators. These were the facts on which rested the foundation of those flourishing commonwealths that arose in the time of the third subrace and are described in theosophical literature. The personal experiences undergone found support from those who were initiated into the eternal laws of mental development. Pardon me. Mighty rulers received initiation in order that personal ability might have its full provision. Trump? Project 2025? Agenda 47? Anyone? Moving on. A man gradually prepares himself for the initiation by his personal ability. He must first develop his forces from below upwards, so that enlightenment may be imparted to him from above. Thus rose the king initiates and leaders of the people among the Atlanteans. In their hands lay a tremendous amount of power, and great, too, was the reverence paid to them. Let's see. Secret knowledge. Man gradually prepares himself for initiation by his personal ability, taking tests to get into culty groups like the Masons, Scientology, any of the esoteric groups, Rosicrucianism, Theosophy. Anyway, moving on. But in this fact lay also the cause of their fall. The development of memory led to enormous personal power. Pride, maybe? Boastfulness? Moving on. The individual began to wish for influence by means of this power of his, and greater the power grew. The more did he desire to use it for himself. The birth of greed. This is sounding a lot like the evolution of the Greek ages, from the gold to the silver to the bronze to the iron ages, and in manners of civilization. Very interesting. When we consider what the Atlanteans were able to do by their command of the life force, we can understand that such misuse must have had tremendous consequences. An enormous power over nature could be placed at the service of personal self-love. Let's see. When we consider what the Atlanteans were able to do by their command of the life force, we can understand that such misuse must have had tremendous consequences. Okay, so that would be, in Scientology terms, that would equate to clearing the planet of the evil thetans, and by use of the technology, and by the misuse of such technology, it creates what L. Ron Hubbard called black Dianetics, the application of Scientology without rendering the solution. Basically, black Dianetics is hardcore propaganda that is not easily detected, or can't be detected unless you know you're looking at propaganda, like AI deepfakes. All right, moving on, because I'm trying to get through this. And this was what happened in the full measure during the period of the fourth subrace, the original Terranians. The members belonging to this race, who were instructed in the mastery of the forces mentioned, made manifold use of these to satisfy their wayward wishes and desires. But these forces, put to such use, naturally destroy one another in their action. It is as if the feet of a man willfully moved forwards, while at the same time the upper part of his body desired to go backwards. Such destructive action could only be arrested by the cultivation of a higher force in man. Wow, this was thought power. Sounds like gay conversion therapy, or deal with your own lust. It's all about thought. It's just the devil attacking you. Interesting. Moving on. The effect of logical thinking is to restrain selfish personal wishes. Don't be greedy. It's all about the sacrifice. Continuing, we must seek the origin of this logical thought in the fifth subrace, the original Semites. Men began to go beyond the simple remembrance of the past. They began to compare their various experiences. The faculty of judgment developed, and wishes and desires were regulated according to this discernment. Man began to calculate and to combine. He learnt to work in thoughts. This reminds me of a movie a lady friend of mine mentioned to me recently. about, it was called The Invention of Lying, about a society where nobody could lie and somebody figured out that they could get other people to do things if they lied to them. Moving on. Whereas formerly he had abandoned himself to every wish, he now asked himself whether on reflection he approved of the wish. While the men of the fourth subrace wildly rushed after the satisfaction of their desires, those of the fifth race began to hearken to the inner voice. And this inner voice had the effect of checking the desires, even if it could not crush the demands of the selfish personality. Oh, so the birth of a conscience. Okay. Thus did the fifth subrace implant within the human soul the interior impulses of action. And in his own soul, man must decide what to do and what to leave undone. Some things are better left unsaid. Using your own moral judgment to make good choices. They're saying that this came from that. No, I don't think so. Moving on. But while man thus gained thought power inwardly, his command over external forces of nature was being lost. Gain one power, lose another. Moving on. The forces of the mineral kingdom can be controlled only by means of this combining thought, not by the life power. It was therefore at the cost of the mastery of the life force that the fifth subrace developed thought power. So Nikola Tesla was trying to get it back? Is that what he was working on? Is that why Crowley wanted to work with him? Is that why there's only 1 degree of separation between Aleister Crowley and Nikola Tesla? All right, moving on. Now it is no longer possible for thought alone, working entirely within, as did the misused forces of earlier times. Even if the personality, self-love, and selfishness were ever so great. Out of this fifth subrace was chosen the most gifted portion, the chosen few, which outlived the destruction of the fifth race or fourth race, and formed the nucleus of the fifth, the Aryan race, whose task it is to bring perfection the power of thought and all that belongs thereto. Brain machine interface, technology manipulation. Asking questions, thinking out loud. Moving on. The men of the sixth subrace, the Akkadian, trained their thought power still more highly than did the fifth. They distinguished themselves from the so-called original Semites by bringing into use a wider sense of the faculty mentioned. It had been said that the development of the thought power did not indeed allow the demands of the selfish personality to attain such destructive results as were possible in earlier races, but that, nevertheless, these demands were not killed out by it. Interesting. So it sounds like they're saying that the earlier behaviors of the subraces or the root races and the latter evolution of thought in the subraces gives us what we now refer to as narcissists. Interesting. Moving on. The original Semites at first regulated their personal affairs as their reason suggested. In place of crude desires and lust, prudence appeared. Other conditions of life presented themselves, whereas the race of former times included to recognize as their leader him whose deeds were deeply engraved in the memory, or who could look back on a life in recollections. Such a role was now rather adjudged to be a wise man, and if formerly that was considered decisive, which was still fresh in the memory, so now that was regarded as best which appealed most strongly to the reason. This brings to mind an old adage: "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Moving on. Under the influence of thought, men once clung to a thing until it was considered insufficient, and then, in the latter case, it was about naturalization that he who had a novelty capability or capable of supplying a want should find a hearing. A love of novelty and a longing for change were, however, developed by this thought power. A love of novelty, so all things new, and a longing for change were, however, developed by this thought power. So progressivism, selfishness, greed, I'm not sure what he was referring to here. Let's move on. Everyone wanted to carry out what his own sagacity suggested. And thus it was that relentlessness begins to appear in the fifth subrace, leading the sixth to the necessity of placing under general laws the capricious ideas of the single individual. Oh, thought control. Thought control is going to be required because otherwise people are going to be greedy. But who's going to control the thoughts? Who's in charge of that? Big Brother? Yeah, another 1984 reference. Moving on. Thus, in the sixth subrace must be sought the original law and legislation. During the third subrace, the segregation of a group of human beings took place only when, in a manner, they were compelled to leave because they no longer felt comfortable within the prevailing conditions brought about by recollection. Oh, you mean like recollection as provided by that propagandic tome known as the Teachings of the Learned Elders of Zion? Things like that? Brought about by recollection? Moving on. It urged men to enterprise and new undertakings. Thus, the Acadians were an enterprising people inclined towards colonization. Interesting. We've seen a lot of that during the imperial periods out of Europe. Moving on. It was commerce especially that fed the young and germinating power of thought and judgment. In the seventh subrace, the Mongolian, thought power also developed, but in them existed qualities of the earlier subraces, especially of the fourth, in a much greater degree than in the fifth and sixth. They remained true to their sense of memory, and so they came to the conclusion that the most ancient must be the wisest, must be that which could best defend itself against the attack of thought. They had indeed lost the command of the life force, but that which developed in them as thought power had itself something of the power of this life force. So they lost control of the life force, but through the power of words and manifestation, they can still somewhat control the life force. Okay, so they didn't lose complete control. Just wow. Moving on, because we're almost done. It is true, according to this, they had lost their power over life, but never the direct instinctive belief in the existence of such a power. So that's where alchemy got its inspiration, perhaps. Moving on. This force indeed became to them their God, in whose service they performed everything which they considered right. Thus they appeared to their neighbors to be possessed of a mystical power, and the latter yielded to it in blind faith. Their descendants in Asia and in some European countries showed and still show much of this peculiarity. The power of thought implemented in the man could only attain its full value in the evolution when, in the fifth race, it required a new impulse. After all, the fourth could only place this power at the service of that which had been fostered by the gift of memory, which was done by pictures apparently, remember? Continuing and closing. It was not until the fifth was reached that such forms of life were attained as could find their instrument in the faculty of thought. I hope you enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed reading it. I'm looking forward to continuing this. Fortunately, there's only 8 chapters in total in this document. If you did enjoy this, please feel free to share this video with anybody that you think might learn something from it. If you have not yet, please give a like and a subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, remember, genuine mental health matters, and hydrate, hippie. Everybody.